Hello everyone, welcome to week 3 of EPM 4355, ISO 14001 Environmental Management Systems. This week we're going to talk a little bit about environmental aspects and compliance obligations. Well, here we start with our diagram, our Plan, Do, Check, Act diagram, and that has the clauses of the 14001 standard mapped to it. This week we see we're moving from leadership into planning, so we're going to be involved with the requirements of clause 6 and all the subclauses in that section of the standard. Today we're going to go over some key definitions, the role of aspects and impacts analysis. We're going to look at some aspects and impacts guidance and requirements, and look at some formats for aspects and impacts analysis. I'm going to talk a little bit about compliance obligation, and then we'll finish with some significant aspects and impacts identification, some methods for doing that. Well, as usual, we're going to begin with some key definitions from the ISO standard. The first one is environmental aspect. This is the term that's most frequently misunderstood by students. An environmental aspect is an element of an organization's activities or products or services that interacts or can interact with the environment. And an environmental aspect can cause an environmental impact, and a significant environmental aspect is one that can have one or more significant environmental impacts. And so the way we determine significant environmental impacts is that we apply criteria. We're going to look at some criteria here in just a minute. So an aspect is an element of an activity or a product or a service. And we'll take a look at some examples of those elements in just a minute. An environmental impact is a change to the environment, whether adverse or beneficial, wholly or partially resulting from an organization's environmental aspects. So an environmental aspect is the cause of a change. So an aspect is the cause of an impact. Compliance obligations, also known as legal requirements and other requirements, are legal and other requirements that an organization has to comply with, including other requirements that an organization has to or chooses to comply with. Now, the compliance obligations come from mandatory requirements like laws and regulations, or they can also come from voluntary commitments, such as organizational and industry standards, contractual relationships, codes of practice, and agreements with community groups or non-governmental organizations. So when we go back to the context of the organization, this is where we look at voluntary commitments based on risks, opportunities, and stakeholder interests. The interests of interested parties, their concerns. Remember now, as part of that analysis, the managers have to determine which commitment from the organizational context is going to become a compliance obligation. Once they determine that, then it enters into the EMS and is managed as a compliance obligation, just as if it were a law or another mandatory requirement. So there's really two types here. There's the required or mandatory from laws and regulations, and voluntary that the organization has chosen to impose on itself based on the analysis of its operating context. Aspects and impacts analysis is really the core of the EMS. This is why you're doing it for the case study. It's one of the most fundamental parts of setting up an EMS because it really drives the majority of the other activities. It's again a process-based exercise, and the aspects and impacts focus environmental management on changes to the internal and external environment. So this is another example of a process that supports the open systems model. We saw from the definitions that an aspect could be considered a driver of change, and an impact is the actual change itself. So the aspect could be emissions to air, and the impact could be increased concentrations of carbon dioxide. When we look at the aspects and impacts from a process standpoint, we see that a negative change could be viewed as a depletion in an ecosystem, whereas a positive change could be reuse of materials. From an outputs viewpoint, a negative change would be pollution. A positive change could be restoration. One of the important parts of and aspects of an impacts analysis is that it includes both positive and negative impacts. Most analyses just focus on the negative. However, there are many times positive impacts. For example, in your case study, you're going to see tune-ups. Now, one of the positive impacts of tune-ups is that the car will run more efficiently and it will use less gas. So that means that the positive impact is less depletion. That it reduces the amount of depletion of oil. Now, aspects and impacts are centered on organizational processes, products, and services rather than on media. This has been the typical way that EPA has regulated and still regulates. But from an organizational standpoint, it makes more sense to look at the processes that are associated with products and services, and then look at the drivers of change as well as the changes that result from those, which enables a much more practical approach to managing environmental impacts and also managing compliance obligations. Now, one of the most important parts of the analysis, and you're going to do this in your case study, is to determine impact significance. And there are multiple criteria. Impact significance is a function of severity and probability and frequency, duration, and geographical boundaries, controllability, reportability, regulatory requirement, plus interested parties. Now, what you want to do is you want to have a multiplicative relationship, and then you can divide by 1,000 or something like that, because what that does is that gives a much higher value for your overall significance rating. And when you have simply additive indicators, they don't really give a clear picture of exactly what's required in terms of what is significant and what's not significant. But when you multiply these together, you get a much greater sensitivity to the actual parts or the criteria for change, and you get a much more accurate reading of significance. So significance, just remember, is a function of all of these elements, and the relationship among the elements is multiplicative. When you look at aspects, consider these as a pretty decent list of the aspects of a particular product or a process. You can look at emissions to air, releases to water, releases to land, use of raw materials and natural resources, use of energy emitted, heat, radiation, vibration, noise, and light, generation of waste or byproducts, and then use of space. So you can start your analysis for the Happy Harry's case study. You can use these as a good start for looking at what the aspects are of each process. This is why you do the inputs and outputs analysis, because that begins to form the foundation for the aspects. So when you think about an operation or a process, you can just ask yourself, are there emissions to air? Are there releases to water, releases to land? Is there use of raw materials? Is there generation of waste? What kind of waste? Toxic waste, solid waste? And use of space. You can use these as criteria because they come from the guidance and the standard. When you look at aspects, one of the critical parts of this analysis is the scope of the EMS. Now, the scope of the EMS is based on a life cycle of the products and services that that the organization uses to generate value. But the analysis should also look at some additional um, activities. And these activities would include design, development of facilities, processes, acquisition of raw materials, including extraction, operational and manufacturing processes, including warehousing, operation and maintenance of facilities, organizational assets, and the operation and maintenance of infrastructure, the environmental performance and practices of external providers, product transportation and service delivery, including packaging, the storage, use, and end-of-life treatment of products, and then waste management, including reuse, refurbishing, recycling, and disposal. Now, you need to give consideration when you do your analysis to these. That doesn't mean that you have to perform a complete life cycle assessment of all of the products and services used by the organization, but if there is a particularly egregious or toxic part of one of these activities or products or services, then you need to include it in your analysis. And so the idea could be, for example, if you're looking at acquisition of raw materials, including extraction, and you have a lot of toxic waste generated during an extraction process, you might want to include that in your analysis as part of one of the raw materials that's coming in. So the activities and products and services really are to be considered over the life cycle, as well as what's been outsourced to various other organizations. So what are the requirements? The first requirement is that within the defined scope, in other words, you have to define a scope first, the organization shall determine the environmental aspects of its activities, products, and services that it can control, and those that it can influence, and their associated environmental impacts considering a life cycle perspective. So remember, we go back to our open systems model now, and we look at those aspects within the system, which is under direct control of managers, and those that it can influence, which are in the transaction-based environment, the next level of shell. But you also want to consider a life cycle perspective. You don't have to do a life cycle analysis, but you have to look at some of the activities we just talked about. The analysis, when you determine your aspects, you're going to look at or take into account change, including planned or new developments or new activities. This would be under the design function usually. Abnormal conditions and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. And so this is, again, linked to emergency preparedness and response. And then you want to look at those aspects that are significant. In other words, you're going to have to determine those by using the established criteria. And we're going to look at the criteria that are in the block text, and we're going to use those. Remember, we saw that multiple criteria for significance, and we looked at the multiplicative relationship of those. The key is here on your paper is to define those criteria and then use them in your analysis. Once the organization has determined what's significant, it needs to communicate those among the various levels, functions of the organization. And this is important because, as you'll see in operational control as well as communication, everyone in the organization needs to be aware of the aspects and impacts of their particular job. The organization also needs to maintain documented information of environmental aspects and their associated impacts, and then the criteria used to determine the significant environmental aspects and the significant environmental aspects. So this is the core part of your paper that you're going to produce for the class. This is important because you can managers can use this to look at the organization from a risk management standpoint, because the significant environmental aspects can result in risks and opportunities from either negative impacts, threats, or opportunities to make things better. When it comes to compliance obligations, the standard is relatively straightforward. The managers of the organization have to determine and have access to the compliance obligations that they've defined for themselves and that are required. They have to show how they determined that these compliance obligations apply to the organization, either through a regulatory compliance analysis or through considering the views of interested parties, and then take these compliance obligations into account as part of the EMS. And then the organization has to maintain documented information of its compliance obligation. And again, we see that compliance obligations can result in risks and opportunities, the risks being around negative non-compliance areas, but opportunities to come into compliance or to exceed the requirements from either the regulatory environment or from interested parties. Finally, the organization has to plan actions to address the significant environmental aspects, its compliance obligations, and the risks and opportunities that are identified from its aspects and impacts analysis. One way to document your compliance obligations are just to simply list the regulatory agency, regulation-specific provision, and then link it to the operation, again linking it numerically. You're going to be doing this in your case study. The foundation for aspects and impacts analysis is a process diagram, input-output diagrams. And I've already outlined, I believe, 13 basic processes at Harry's, and you can analyze those using this particular approach. What are your inputs and what are your outputs? Because this gets you a long way towards understanding the aspects of every particular process. And so you can see from the inputs and outputs where the aspects arise and what they are. And you can probably combine perhaps several outputs to one aspect of a particular process. You're going to perform this, you're going to be filling out this table. This is one way to do it, where you list the operation, the inputs and the outputs, and the environmental aspect associated with each input and output, and then the environmental impact, the changes associated with each aspect, for example, generation of waste. So this is the foundation for your analysis, and you're going to want to have everything numbered. This is all described in the assignment for the final paper, so that you can have traceability throughout the analysis. Again, the next step would be to provide or consider the compliance obligations in your analysis, because again, these go back to the specific operations. This is what we're tying everything to operations and processes. Finally, we're going to combine it here in a table that provides an overall analysis. So again, we start with the operation. We look at one particular aspect, one impact, and then we're going to evaluate these criteria: severity, likelihood, frequency, boundaries, controllability, regulatory status, reportability, stakeholder concerns, duration. I'm going to multiply the ratings for these to get an overall rating. And so this is part of what you're going to do in your teams. And then we're going to determine if they're significant. The key here is that you're going to draw a line. What is significant and what's not? You're going to have to decide, based on the overall rating and how you derive this, which aspects and impacts are significant. And so those are the ones that are going to be managed. But this is really the important part of this analysis, is where you draw this line. So not only do you have to define the scales for these factors, you have to define how you set the line between yes and no. Where is it the significance set? In other words, what is the rating at which an aspect and impact becomes significant? And where is the rating below which an aspect and impact are not significant? But you won't know that until you perform the analysis. You've got to define all of the way in which you are going to set up your calculations here. Now this is set up so that you can import this table into Excel. I recommend that you do that. And this also is going to take a considerable amount of consensus and teamwork, working together to figure out where this line is. But you must draw the line because you're going to set some objectives based on what's above that line. So it's a very important step. So that's it for today's lecture. Ask any questions in the instructor office threads, and I'll see you online.